what we're going to do is we're actually going to finish Romans 1 and do the first half of Romans 2, okay? Because it's covering the same topic. All right. And let me just warn you ahead of time that tonight's not the most uplifting passage, okay? But so this might make you feel miserable and downcast and depressed, but take heart. The gospel's coming. There is good news, but we got to get through some bad news first. Okay, so we're in Romans 1, and tonight we're going to start in verse 18. Now, verses 18 to 32 of Romans 1 might be the most depressing passage of Scripture maybe in the entire Bible. Okay, and so just be forewarned that Paul's setting up an argument. Romans is very systematic in the way that he talks about it. So he's building an argument. He's starting with the bad news. Okay? So what we're going to look at tonight is sin, the topic of sin, and more specifically, God's wrath against sin. Okay? Tonight we're going to talk about God's wrath primarily on unrighteous Gentiles, people like us. Paul's going to make an argument that Gentiles, and what are Gentiles? Who are Gentiles? Not Jews, okay? Gentiles are sinners and they are under God's wrath. Next week, Paul's going to make a similar argument that God's wrath is also on self-righteous Jews who think they're better than Gentiles because they're God's chosen people, and they're actually under wrath too because they also have sinned, okay? So that's where we're headed. So let's start with this question. Before we look at Romans 1, at the top of your notes, here's a question somebody might ask. Why study about sin? And why spend an entire 2 weeks on the wrath of God? Okay? And here's the reason. Only a true knowledge of the seriousness of your spiritual condition can lead to a proper cure. Let me say that a simpler way. You won't go to the doctor if you don't think you're sick, right? And so, if you don't think that you're that bad, and I had this awakening back late college into seminary. I had this awakening that I really didn't appreciate the gospel because I had a low view of God and I had a very high view of myself. I really didn't think I was that bad. And if you talk to most people, when people ask the question, why does God let bad things happen to good people? What's the assumption? That there's good people, right? And so, next in your notes, a true knowledge of sin and wrath will make you a wise person. Okay? If you have a very low view of yourself, and what I mean by low view is not low self-esteem, but you don't think very highly of your spiritual state, and you think highly of God, if you take serious sin and God's wrath, there's a couple of things that are going to happen. You're going to be better equipped to fight against your own sin, right? Because you're going to take it seriously, and you're going to know what it is that you're fighting against. And you will be better prepared to help others overcome their sin. One of the issues when I counsel people is helping them to see that they are not nearly as good as they think they are. And that's what Paul's going to make this argument about. Okay? Knowing the nature of sin and knowing the nature of God's wrath will make you cherish the gospel. That's the next blank in your notes. You will cherish the gospel if you really know how sinful we are. Okay? So the reason we're going to spend 2 weeks on this sin and wrath and how bad are we is because the next week is going to be really sweet. When Paul makes the turn in his argument towards the good news. We've got to talk about bad news. In order to make sense of the gospel, Paul must now explain why we need the gospel. Okay? So here we go. Let's look at, we're going to take this in sections, all right? Bite-sized pieces so that we don't get overwhelmed. Let's look at Romans 1, and if somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 18 to 23. And we're going to talk about God's wrath on the unrighteous. All right? So somebody would read Romans 1, verses 18 to 23. Go.
The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible quality, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of an immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles.
Okay. A lot going on there, so let's take it slow, verse by verse, and let's see what argument is Paul making here. Okay. He starts off in verse 18, and he says that God's wrath, his anger against sin, has been revealed against human wickedness. Okay? You look at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Okay? What is God's wrath? When we talk about wrath, or if you're British, wrath. Okay, that's how they say it, wrath. What is that? And here's a good definition for you in your notes there. God's wrath is the unwavering response of a righteous God against sin. Okay? You have a righteous, holy God, and it's his response to sin and rebellion. Okay? So, now we have another word here, ungodliness. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. Ungodliness is a lack of reverence. Ultimately, it's a lack of reverence for God and a failure to worship him. That's going to be the issue in this passage, is that people don't worship God. Right? They don't acknowledge him as God. They ignore him. Okay? And he says not only ungodliness, but he says unrighteousness of men. Unrighteousness is the result of ungodliness. It's a failure to conform to God's law, right? God has this standard of perfection, and he says we all fall short of that, and that is considered unrighteousness. Righteousness means being right with God. Unrighteousness means you're not right with God, because you in some way have rebelled against him. Okay? And here's what Paul's argument is. What do these ungodly people do by their unrighteousness, according to verse 18? What does unrighteousness lead us to do?
Suppress the truth.
Suppress the truth. What does suppress mean?
Hide.
Hold back, to hide it, to restrain it. We don't want truth. I don't want to know truth. I just want to hide it and hold it down. Don't tell me truth. Don't speak truth. I would rather believe a lie willingly than to know the truth. Okay? And here's the problem. We all suppress the truth when we resist God's word and we cling to sin. Right? Megan, if you don't mind going to the first verse there, just type the space bar is fine, I think. Yeah. Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And the psalmist talks about these people. They are corrupt and they do abominable deeds, and there is none who do good. Right? Not a very pretty picture of us, right? Now, we often say that an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God, right? That's what atheist means. Who is the fool here? The fool is the person who says in his heart that there is no God. This isn't talking about atheism. This is talking about people who claim to believe in God, but with their heart, they act as if there is no God. They act as if they're not accountable to God. Does that make sense? These are functional, practical atheists. These aren't atheists that stand up and say, I don't believe in God. These are people that say, I believe in God, they go to church, and yet they deny the faith by the way that they live, because they live as if they're not accountable to a God. Does that make sense? That's who Paul's talking about. Okay? And so the issue is pride. Pride, this is the next blank in your notes, pride is the root of our sin. It's pride. And what happens is when we're proud, it leads to us not being thankful. Thanklessness, not giving thanks to God for what He's done, is the fruit of our sin. Pride is the root. Thanklessness is the fruit of our sin. Notice go to verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him, pride, but they became, or give thanks to Him. They did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him. Pride led them to not giving thanks to God for what He alone gave. Y'all see that? Okay. Y'all can go. It's totally okay. Thank y'all for dropping in. Have a good night. Is that your bottle? Okay. Okay. Now here's a question. Last week, Ashley asked, "What about people who've never heard about Jesus? What's going to happen to those people?" Paul's going to deal with that here. Look at verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Hey, Colin, come on in. You need a pen? Got it? Or you got this one?
Nope, I'll stand for you.
Mute yourself. Mute. Mute. Sorry. Alright, so what about these people that say they've never heard of God? Is that even true? And here's what Paul says in verse 19 about them. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to him. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power, His divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. And what does the Bible say about those people? They're without excuse, right? Why are they without excuse? It's all around them, right? They can't say, I didn't know God, because God has clearly revealed who He is in the things that have been made, in creation. Okay? So, here's what he's saying. In verse 19, what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. God has plainly revealed Himself in two ways. First, in our conscience. Our conscience. C-O-N, science. If you can't spell science, I'm sorry. Okay? Conscience. Alright, let's think about that. What does that mean? God has made Himself known in our conscience. Everybody has a conscience. And what's the purpose of a conscience? Tell you right from wrong, right? Everybody, according to Scripture, has the law written on their heart. They know the difference between right and wrong. Even people who say, I don't believe in right or wrong, they still believe in wrong when you punch them in the face. Right? That's a crazy example, but there's no such thing as like a moral relativist where they say, well, what's right for you is right for you and what's wrong for you is wrong for you, but don't push that on me because that's no big deal. If you punch them in the face, they're going to say, why did you do that? And you're going to say, because I thought it was right. And my right is my right, and you can't say that I'm wrong. It doesn't make sense because now they know that's not right. And then, after you punch them in their face, let's carry this a little further, then you steal their wallet. And they say, why did you do that? That's mine. And you say, it doesn't matter. There's no wrong, so I can do whatever I want to. And they say, no, wait a minute. That's mine. That's wrong. They know it's wrong because they have a conscience. And they know deep down that it's not right. Now here's the deal. Where did that come from? Where does even the notion of right and wrong come from if we're all the product of some evolutionary biological process and you all came from pond scum? Why would pond scum develop to know the difference between right and wrong? Where does that even come from? Here's the deal. if there's a moral law, if there's a right and wrong, then there also has to be a moral lawgiver. And that moral lawgiver put the law of God in your heart, so you'll know the difference. Okay? So God has revealed Himself in our conscience. And verse 20 says that He has also plainly revealed Himself in creation. Right? Good. He's plainly revealed Himself in creation.
I have a question.
Yes.
So those unreached people, even though they're like more clearly apt to see God, but most of them turn it into they come up with some fictitious, who knows, 10,000 different gods that answer to different things.
Right.
So, in my sense, but they don't know who the true God is. So how exactly would that play out for them? Because I'm like, nobody's really there to tell them that, no, it's not these thousands God, but it's the one true God. But in their head, they don't really know exactly who's in charge, so they come up with something to explain things that they're not. So exactly how...
Really good question, and that's exactly what you should be thinking. That's thinking critically, because now you're asking, all right, if God's revealed Himself in creation, how come these pagans don't know Him? If it's supposed to be plain. And here's what we need to understand. Just because God's revealed Himself in creation doesn't mean that that's sufficient gospel knowledge for them to come to faith in Jesus Christ. You made the point that those people believe in gods. So they know there's gods. And when you read the book of Acts, Paul talks to the Greeks and he says, you guys have idols everywhere. Like, you believe in gods. Because they clearly see that this couldn't have just happened. There has to be a God that made this. And they were even so careful to have a statue to the unknown God, because they didn't want to miss one. And so what they needed was gospel proclamation to make it clear, which is what Paul did, that all these gods that you've served are not true gods, but there is one true and living God, and He's the creator of all things. And He's made Himself known in the person of Jesus Christ, who was crucified and was raised from the dead. So now Paul brings that gospel clarity. Does that make sense? Just because He's clearly revealed Himself in creation, that doesn't mean it's sufficient knowledge. What it does mean is it's enough evidence for people to be without excuse on the day of judgment. Okay? That's his point. Which is why he says we need to take the gospel to all nations, because they don't have sufficient knowledge of who the one true God is. Does that make sense? Okay, good questions. Now, what does creation show? First, creation displays God's power. Right? You can't look at the sun burning and giving off that kind of heat and not realize that there had to be some powerful being that put that there. Right? You ever try just to go out and look at the sun? Okay, you can't do it, right? I mean, it's not. Don't do it either, right? It's not a good game. You know, we'd have that game growing up. Like, who could stare at the sun the longest? You know?
Walk around blind for 5 minutes.
Yeah, you're like, okay, ready? Record's 5, and you're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I got 6, and you can't see for the next 10 hours, right? Because I got 6, I broke the record. Now think about this. You can't look at the sun for more than 3 or 4 seconds. What do you think it would be like to look into the face of the God who put the sun there? All right, now get that in your mind, because that's what Paul's saying. That's the power of God that we're talking about. That's the kind of glory we're talking about. Creation displays God's power because He made it all work. Right, the earth is spinning on an axis at the exact right angle, an exact distance from the sun that sustains life on this planet. That's the kind of power we're talking about. Okay? Psalm 19 verse 1. This is a good verse to memorize. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork. It's clear in creation, which is the next blank. Creation displays His power, and it also displays His glory, His worth. Okay? And Paul's point here, and this is the next line in your blank, in your notes, everyone is without excuse. Okay? Now, what does that mean? When Paul says everyone is without excuse at the end of verse 20, what that means, and it's next line in your blanks, if God holds everyone without excuse, that means He holds every person responsible for their sin. You're responsible for your sin, and I'm responsible for mine. Even those who have never heard the gospel are justly condemned. So, how do you answer the question, what about all those innocent people in other tribes of other nations who've never heard about the gospel? The answer would be, they go to heaven. Yeah. So you missed a word there. What happens to all of the innocent people who've never heard the gospel in other nations? They go to heaven. Any innocent person gets to go to heaven. If you never sin, that's one way to get to heaven. Don't sin ever. The problem is, what's the problem? Obviously, there's no innocent people in other nations, because even though they don't have the law, they make up their own rules and they still break them, and they sin against what's the conscience that's within them. Okay. And so that's why even those who've never heard the gospel will be justly condemned, which all the more gives us urgency to take it to people who've never heard, right?
Are we also hold accountable? Because I feel like even though there are people out there that haven't heard the gospel, I feel like at some point God would kind of hold us accountable for those that didn't go out and actually, because I feel like it's partially, the blame kind of partially falls on us if we don't go out there and try to reach those people because we haven't done our job or what we were called to do. And so we're kind of left to be blamed. I feel like to be blamed for those that don't hear the gospel if we're not willing to go out and do it.
You're right. And that's exactly what Paul said last week. Somebody read Romans 1 verse 14. What does he say? Remember what Paul said because he got the gospel? I'm in debt to them. I'm under obligation. Right? Cynthia, you're right. And that's the point Paul's making. We have a great obligation to take the gospel to these people. Okay? Let's look at verse 21. For although they knew God, they know Him. They don't want to admit it all the time, but they know God. They did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. Colin, I've got a Bible there if you want to use it next to the lamp there, underneath that smaller book. Sorry, dude, I would offer earlier. We're in Romans 1. Alright, what's verse 21 saying? It's there in your notes. All people reject God. Every single one of us. Okay? Although everyone knows God exists, we refuse to give Him the honor He deserves. That's the point of that verse. Which means we fail to glorify Him for His beauty. He's a beautiful God who creates beautiful things, and we don't wake up every day and say, thank you, God, for these things that you've made. It's beautiful. We don't do that. We take for granted the fact that when you woke up this morning, the sun held the earth in orbit, and the planets circled around the sun, and you had oxygen, and you woke up, and you went to bed, and you go to sleep, and you wake up, and we got in that pattern, right? We don't give thanks to God. It's just, we take it for granted. And especially people who don't know God, or who reject Him, they're certainly not going to glorify Him for His beauty. And we fail to thank Him for His blessings. I think the next one is Acts 14. I think that's the next verse that I did. Oh, no, Jeremiah 5. Let me read this one real quick. Hear this, O foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but see not, who have ears but hear not. Do you not fear me, declares the Lord? Do you not tremble before me? I place the sand as the boundary for the sea, a perpetual barrier that it cannot pass. And though the waves toss, they cannot prevail. Though they roar, they cannot pass over it. As far as the ocean wants to come, it can't go as far as God told it to stop at the beach. He says, you see that and you hear that and you don't fear me. That's the failure that we have. Go to the next one. I think it's Acts 14. Yeah. All right, so here's what's going on in Acts 14. A little background. There are people in this town that have seen the miracles that Paul did, and they're trying to worship and make sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. They're idolaters, right? They just want to make a god out of Paul. And Paul asked them this question. Someone read these verses from Acts 14.
Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart with food and gladness.
You see the goodness of God? People who didn't even know God, God still gave them rain. Still gave them crops, still gave them food, and they didn't thank Him for it. And He overlooked those times of ignorance. He was still good to them even though they didn't glorify Him for it. They didn't thank Him. And so, here's what Paul's point is here. Verse 22. It says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. This is the person who rejects God. So here's the point. Our refusal to honor God leads to foolishness. What that means is, apart from God, your search for purpose in your life will lead you to meaningless conclusions. People will waste their life doing stupid things that have no eternal purpose because they don't know God. Apart from God, we replace truth for deception. John 3:19. This is the judgment. This is God's judgment, that light has come into the world and people love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. So what happens when we don't have a right view of God? Look at verse 22 and 23. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. All right, now look in verse 23. In their foolishness, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. That's where the foolishness leads to. It leads to idolatry. A wrong view of God, and this is important, a wrong view of God leads to idolatrous worship. These are two big words you can write at the top of your notes, and you can write it every single week, and this is why we go deep with this stuff. Theology matters. Theology matters. What you believe about God will determine how you worship Him and whether or not you worship Him rightly. Okay? And a person apart from God's grace in their own wisdom will only prove to be foolish in God's sight. Okay, this comes from 1 Corinthians 1, verse 20. Megan? Where is the one who is wise? And where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? There's people who think they're wise because they know how science works or they know about technology, but they don't know God. This next line in your notes is actually a quote from John Calvin. John Calvin said, "Our foolish hearts are idol factories." How much time's left?
42 seconds.
You can start it at the end if you want. You don't have to wait all the time if you want to.
Stop and start it.
Yeah.